Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 42. And as you all know, 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. So it's appropriate that this episode is about a new offering from Strata called Identity Continuity. Our guest today is Granville Schmidt, Chief Architect at Strata. Welcome, Granville.
Thank you. Super excited to be here.
And Mark Callahan, Senior Director of Product at Strata. Welcome, Mark.
Hey there.
So I guess maybe we could start with, I was reading the article, the background, the homework that we assigned, and it mentioned that in Logic Monitor's survey of IT leaders, 93% of the top 2,000 companies reported that downtime costs exceeded $300,000 per hour, and almost half of them reported hourly costs were more than $1 million per hour. And with those kind of numbers, I think every enterprise needs IDP continuity. And so, Granville, what are some of the solutions that enterprises are deploying today to mitigate this risk? Like, what's the current situation?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really helpful to take a quick step back and let's look at the landscape for applications currently. So when designing an application inside of an enterprise, you're already dealing with continuity issues. Typically, you're not just running a single application on a single server, but typically you're going to run on multiple servers, right? And the more advanced applications, they might be spread across multiple data centers, maybe multiple regions, and so the application itself is handling these more highly available topologies. But then you start layering on additional services like maybe databases. Cool. Now you have to have a database that crosses multiple regions. What does that mean? And then you start looking at the whole stack. Some of these enterprise applications are massive, right? It's not just a simple application code and their database, but it might have 10, 20, 30 different other ancillary services there. And so typically these enterprises are able to architect their applications and handle the HA of these backend systems. But what they typically don't have is what happens if my identity provider goes down, right? So it's arguably the most important part of the network stack or the application stack is how do you verify who someone is if the identity provider is down? And so today, oftentimes, continuity doesn't really quite exist the same way that these ancillary services exist for applications, right? So with a database, you're able to replicate it and have different instances and be able to sync that asynchronously. But for identity, if you use a cloud IDP, they might have multiple regions for things, but your data might be locked down to a single region. But what happens in the case where that network is dropped, right? And you can't access it during that time. And some people might decide to, okay, maybe we go reconfigure a single application to point to our on-premises, directory server. That works. But what happens if you have 4,000 applications?
Yeah.
And so the gist of it is today, most enterprises do not have a solution for identity continuity, which is...
Mark, I'm sure you're going to parrot some of this, but I always remind people that product managers, their most important job is to talk to customers. And I bet that you also talk to a lot of customers about this challenge. What did you find customers were saying about this?
We do, and just for a touch of additional clarity, I'm actually on the product marketing side, and I just wanted to put that bit of clarity in there just for the sake of, as talking to the customers, I'm listening more for the overall business issue that they're facing, and what we're hearing is, I'm going to bring in an analogy here, just being kind of a car nut, which is everything that Granville just described is you could make sure that your car is absolutely in tip-top shape and running in the best of all conditions. If you lose the car keys, the car's not going anywhere. It's not the fault of the car. The car is in great condition. It's doing all things it should. And that's honestly what we're hearing from customers too, is that they're realizing that there's this new introduction of I hate saying a single point of failure, but it honestly is a bottleneck for operations, that you lose the car keys. great. It's got a full tank of gas. Everything's, it's got 15 miles on it. It's a brand new vehicle. It should work fine. But if you don't have the keys to get in the door or start it, you're not going anywhere. And that cost of downtime is just amazing. I saw someone was talking at EIC about BMW's cost of downtime, and it was actually in the order of one of BMW's assembly lines, and I believe it was North Carolina. If it's down for an hour, that's $10 million of loss. And that can happen from just one line of business computer not being available. And it's like, you realize how fragile systems actually are to IDPs if you just can't get in and do what you need to do. And so, our customers, there's honestly, to a degree, customers were saying originally, is this even possible? Is there a way to, instead of bounce back faster, is there a way to just never go offline? And I think what we've shown is that's possible. So it's been a fun place to tell that story as a marketer.
So I'll pivot back into the technical side of how is this possible? And I think I used that tagline on a couple of my LinkedIn promotions as, is this even possible? And let's just be clear, what we're talking about here is maybe load balancing between Okta and Entra, Microsoft Entra. Am I right there?
I mean, man, when you posted this on LinkedIn as that tagline, I was like, man, that's actually really spot on. That's a really good way to look at it. Coming from my working on networking and security technologies, it's almost identical, right? Like for us, we have a product called the Orchestrator. This Orchestrator is, it can serve many different functions, from being serving as an OIDC provider, a SAML provider, LDAP provider, but it can also be an identity aware proxy. And what's cool about this is that when we connect this Orchestrator to these IDPs, we're doing health checks on them, right? And it's very similar to how a load balancer works. A load balancer says, hey, I'm taking this domain and maybe this path, and I'm going to route it to this backend server. And before doing so, I need to make sure that backend server is online, or else I'm going to route that request to a different server. So yeah, that's a really good way to visualize it. And so thank you. I'm actually going to feel that from now.
Can I drill down on that just a little bit?
Yeah.
One of the challenges, and one of the underappreciated challenges, I think, is key management. And a lot of the underlying trust from identity comes in signing assertions. So we have some type of token, an ID token or an access token, and we sign that token. And so, of course, there's underlying keys, and there's a key rotation process that has to happen. And one of the things I wonder there is it's not really as simple as routing, let's say, IP traffic, right, in a router. It's a little bit harder there. And one of the challenges has to do with the distribution and rotation of keys. How would you get two, let's say, SaaS IDP providers, Okta and Entra for sake of argument, to be able to have the same keys? Or am I thinking about it the wrong way, or is that too much wishful thinking?
No, it's a really good question. We tackle it a slightly different way. So because of the different ways that the Orchestrator can morph into environments, there's a couple ways to look at it. So if you have a simple application and the Strata Orchestrator decides to be an identity aware proxy in that use case, you can connect it to Okta Entra. But when the user goes to log in, they'll go authenticate with Okta or Entra, depending on which one is online at that time and based on the policy that's been defined. And once that session has been established with that IDP, we also establish a session on our side. And so from that point on, the application trusts us, and we build that chain of trust with the IDP. Now, in more sophisticated or even simpler use cases, depending on your applications, we might serve as a OIDC or SAML provider. And what that means is that we're the ones to mint the tokens or sign those assertions. And the end user is still authenticating with that online IDP at that time. So the applications trust us, and we trust that we did things correctly with the IDP up until that point.
And Mark, how do customers understand this flow? Do they see what do they see as Strata's role as being almost a router or a cloud service, and how do you communicate this to customers?
I think one of the key things there is that we actually didn't set out to create identity continuity as our first offering. It was actually something that came as about of what Granville was talking about, which was, our underlying identity orchestration service, which can do a number of things. We hear from customers about what they'd like to do with those things. And part of that is you're actually using the orchestrator to create this composable identity fabric. And that identity fabric could involve multiple IDPs, because in some cases, thinking about like M&A, company, the new co and old co, the acquired co, bringing those two together, we could support concurrent IDPs in that scenario, so that old co organization is functional and generating value from day one. But as you think about continuity aspect, it's like, well, you've already got this scenario where you can have two interchangeable IDPs. The customers are then saying, well, through no fault of Okta or no fault of Microsoft, should one of those IDPs become unavailable, what do you do? And so the idea there is the idea of being able to fail over between the two services themselves and move over. And Mike, started off the conversation with the Okta and Microsoft Entra ID. I think one that's even a little bit more easy for our customers to think about is purely the idea of like, what happens if you lose the network? And it could be planned. We used a cruise ship as a fun case example there. In port, you've got plenty of great network access, but when you're out at sea in international waters, maybe you have Starlink, maybe you have satellite connectivity, but if you don't, there's this planned disconnect mode. And so in that scenario, it's this area of failing over from a cloud IDP to an on-prem user store. And that one really resonates with customers. Yeah, we're fully capable of that cloud to cloud, but just from a logic perspective, I think customers initially say, well, I've already got Active Directory. Could you fail over and back up to Active Directory? And the answer is yes.
I think actually this leads perfectly into my next question, because one of the little bullet items I read on your product description was that Mavericks, which I guess is the product, a product component, can be air gapped and what was the other word? Air gapped and let me check. Air gapped and distributed. And so is what you're saying that there's actually maybe a local deployment, or how do you achieve air gapped in that situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So air gapped for Strata, and in particular our orchestration product, that can be deployed in any customer's environment. So whether that's in on-premises data centers or in their cloud providers or across cloud providers. And so the air gap here is that they control their config, and at any point in time, so they can control that, they can deploy those orchestrators however they want. From our SaaS side is able to configure and monitor those orchestrators, but we actually do it in a way that's pretty unique in the sense that the customer owns the infrastructure at which that configuration goes to. And so they can actually build asynchronous processes that are able to take the final configuration for that orchestration fabric and deploy it in a way that where we don't have direct access into their environment. And when the orchestrators see this latest configuration, they'll update themselves and handle the unique deltas.
So it pulls configurations when it's connected, let's say, or in a controlled environment when you want to.
Exactly.
Mark, I'm going to ask the obvious question here. It sounds like Strata is the new single point of failure.
That's a fair question as well. As you think about this, the important thing that we are talking to our customers about, and the customers have become really comfortable with, is the idea of that distributed orchestrator software. So that scenario that Granville was just discussing, the idea of that the configuration is done through the cloud SaaS, but when you look at the actual software itself, it's this really highly performant and very lightweight piece of software. It's a little binary that's running in that deployed scenario right by the applications. And so the answer could be a yes, and it also is the idea of using that orchestrated environment, it's not just one of continuity, it's also all the other runtime services that they're trying to integrate and all the other additional things that you can do with an identity fabric that makes that an attractive proposition. And so there's fact, and there's also the story of, the highly performant nature of the orchestrators. And even to the end that we actually were just at a Army event last week, and we were talking specifically about DDIL environments. And DDIL is a kind of unique thing for me. It was new to me, which is in the Armed Services and Department of Defense, DDIL stands for environments where you have degraded, disconnected, intermittent, and low bandwidth services. And lots of reasons that could happen.
Texas.
Yeah, that's a lot, right? That was a mouthful, right? But where that we had early on talked about the idea that this could work in a submarine, this could work at sea, this could work, on a rocket ship. The thing that really brought this home is that as we were, talking with the Army in particular, they're looking at ways, how do you do this in a deployed forward operating site environment where you could actually have services on a box and you could actually still maintain identity in this forward operating site that's completely disconnected from the rest of the world, but you still have to have things that are possible for visiting soldiers or visiting military personnel that are coming on base into that forward operating site who need access to site-specific applications, whether it's maintenance, whether it's canteen.
Or let's say you're riding around on a disconnected ship and you pick up somebody on a life raft, and then that guy needs access.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. And so, yeah, back to the scenario of answering the question, it was, because it's controlled by the customer, and you can, and I'll defer to you on this one, that story that we talked about with orchestrators being little grains of sand in that distributed fashion. Anything else you'd want to add to that on the performance side?
Yeah. I think it's a really critical thing is that going back to the comparison to applications and how they're deployed. If you take an application, you put it on a single server, it's a single point of failure. If you make it across multiple servers, you spread out the availability of that application. If you do so in multiple regions around the world, you increase the availability of it. Now, Strata is no different. We actually allow customers to build the topology that makes sense for them. So the orchestrators can achieve what I like to, it's a term I made up, which is like cascading HA. And what I mean by this is that you can have high availability, but you can actually build a topology of these orchestrators that can be scattered around the world and actually point it in a way that if there is a failure somewhere, ideally it's isolated to like a single application or a single server somewhere.
Right. And just to dig down on that a little bit, this orchestrator, as you're calling it, has an OpenID or SAML interface. So the applications locally can interface with it as normal. Am I right?
Exactly.
I describe OpenID sometimes as the new web interface. You know how like in the old days you have a web server, and now it's like everything's got a web interface, right? The router might have its own web server in it. And I kind of feel like OpenID is like that a little bit too. Like we have OpenID servers, IDPs, but then OpenID turns out is an interesting interface for authentication providers. And so we're just seeing more and more. So you have an orchestrator with an OpenID interface that can act as an OpenID provider, or I guess a SAML IDP, because in the enterprise space, there's still a lot of SAML out there.
Exactly.
And, one of the features you mentioned that I think is really hard for customers to deal with is managing schema. And here we're specifically talking about user claims, the little bits of information like first name, last name, email address that the applications actually need in order to work. Before we get into the technical bits, maybe Mark, you could say a couple of words about this. Must have bubbled up as a concern, but what do you see as some of the challenges around managing schema within applications?
Yeah, for sure. No, and it was an observation that actually came about before we even came up with this idea for an identity continuity product offering. In those scenarios that I was discussing, like M&A, where you have two concurrent ADPs that you're managing for two discrete user groups. That could also be, partners are managed on one IDP, and the workforce, the FTEs, are on another. Is that as you get into those, you would think that those attribute categorizations would be common, that first name is always first name, and that last name is always last name, and email is always email. And truth of the matter is that's not the case. As we look across not only the IDPs, but you also start looking at the different identity services, whether it's MFA and others, is you start realizing that those attribute categories have slightly different variations for how they're described internally by the different vendors. And so as we looked at this from an identity fabric perspective, we had to make some rationalization between those already. What we realized was how much more weight that carried when you're looking at truly switching from one IDP to another in a failover scenario, and how critical that is for maintaining consistent policies. And so, that schema mapper, happy to go into a little more technical side of it, but it's first name may actually be spelled differently, first underscore name. It literally is very minute differences that can break and have the whole thing fall down if those aren't handled appropriately. So
Right. And the so we're talking about the claim names, like first underscore
correct.
name or
Sorry,
last
yes,
underscore
claim
name.
names, yes.
But what if the data needs to be transformed? Sometimes, like, let's just take member of. Sometimes you might get the DN of the group, or you might get the group name. Does the platform have any capability to transform the values, not just, let's say, the keys?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually in addition to what Mark was mentioning, it's actually one of the most critical reasons for the schema transformation is that within our platform, we have the ability to not just do basic claim like key mapping, like the first underscore name to first name or F name or something like that, but also the ability to say, hey, based on the value we get here, we need the ability to like deserialize this, break this down, transform this, basic things like, oh, we need this entire thing to be uppercase or lowercase, or we're taking a group of data and that we then need to split out to make multiple claims. That's all achievable today via what we call service extensions.
And is that, I know from your past life, you're a JavaScript guru. Is that a little bit of JavaScript code that you can insert? And does that JavaScript code enable you to also make external calls, like maybe to call an API during that transformation?
Okay. Well, maybe JavaScript guru might be a little far stretched, but I definitely enjoyed my time. But in the orchestrator, everything that is provided today is achieved via writing Golang. So Golang is our language of choice for customers to create unique things for their environment and like to build like the equivalent of plugins today. In the future, we're looking at other options, but right now it's all Golang.
And so, Mark, maybe you could tell me about the cloud control plane, because it sounds like you have this distributed network of orchestrators, some of them connected, some of them detachable, let's say. And I'm gathering then that this cloud control plane is a really critical piece of how the customer gets sort of economies of scale. Can you talk a little bit about like who's the end user there? Is it the CISO? Is it the DevOps team? And what are some of the requirements that sort of filter up into the cloud control plane that Strata provides?
That's interesting. Initially, it was very much the IAM team. So it's like the IAM architects who's looking for a way to really, if you think about IAM tech debt and you just think about all the different multi-generational services that somebody's acquired, before you even took the job as the IAM architect of an organization, there were probably 3 people before you who had that same job and made decisions that made sense at the time. And so what you've got is this gumball of things that just kept sticking together, and you needed a way to functionally and practically manage all of those in a common fashion. And so the IAM architect was the initial conversation. Now, in creating, the UI that we have so you can interface with this, is that we're hearing needs from the audit team, the compliance organizations, where they may have not the need to actually go in and set up the policies and manage the services themselves, but have some level of visibility and observability to what's happening. And so I think that what we're seeing is that the core user is expanding in terms of the role of who uses the cloud control plane. And the other thing is that we're hopefully elevating it a bit to a place where you don't have to be a unicorn, where somebody, maybe a touch more technical than me, but you don't need to be a Granville to actually work with Mavericks, that you can actually have a team, that can do a little bit more through the interface itself. And so, I think it's twofold. It's making it more accessible to less skilled identity practitioners, and also expanding it to the needs of other members of the organization who might be saying, hey, I want to look at this for audit reasons or compliance reasons.
I see. And Granville, it seems like now that we have this orchestrator that can route between IDPs, there might be an opportunity to insert some authorization logic. Like maybe a certain IDP isn't trusted anymore, or does Strata have a strategy here, or is that part of how do you integrate that into the continuity product?
Yeah, absolutely. So within our core orchestration platform, there is the ability to write your own authorization policies. And we have the ability to also integrate in with other PDPs or even PIPs to be able to get additional information. So today you have your own access policies via those IDPs. But once everything's been authenticated and we get the authorization from those IDPs in certain cases, you then supplement or layer on the authorization policy defined in our platform to do additional enforcement. And where this is super interesting is when we talk about continuity. Maybe when everything is fine and we're all online and we're connected to, say, Microsoft Intra, admins can go in and manipulate data like they normally would. However, maybe if we fail over to an on-premises IDP that might be less trusted, our policies can be like, hey, you're going to authenticate with this on-premises IDP, but we're now going to enforce MFA onto this that isn't even provided by that IDP. And in addition, we may choose not to allow admins to do certain things or allow them to do other things that they wouldn't be able to do if they were online. So our policy provides that additional governance, if you will, to be able to manage those very unique circumstances.
I hate to be the car guy, but Mike, do you mind if I throw in another car analogy here?
Please.
All right. So, as Granville was talking about that scenario where you fail over to on-prem, let's say AD, we're kind of likening it to a spare tire. And the idea there is that you aren't going to be driving over 65 on the spare tire, that there's certain limited. Well, I take that back. I've seen a lot of people do a lot more than 65 on a donut. And
you're not driving over 65.
Give them all the space in the world as they go flying by. You're not intended to drive over 65 in doing so. Yeah. And, the idea of being able to enforce MFA, in those scenarios where we're truly isolated, you could have a physical hardware token, like a YubiKey, which could actually still help to add an additional level of security to the authentication events that are taking place in that disconnected state until you're able to fail back to the primary IDP. So there's what I guess I'm trying to say there is there's an awareness of saying that the secondary state may not be one that you're going to call 100% parity for the primary state. And that's okay. The intent is the mission critical applications continue to have access throughout until such time that the health of the primary is noted as ready to come back.
Mark, if I could ask you a follow-up question, you said the F word, FIDO. And so I want to follow up there. Of course, there's been a terminology change. We now generally say passkeys. But it's almost like as somebody who talks to customers, have you heard questions about, we want to use this IDP, but maybe we also want to add passkeys in? And I'm just curious, as somebody with his ear to the ground to the market, if you're hearing any chatter, and questions from customers about passkeys, or if this is really still maybe further out in the future.
No, we definitely have. Let's also give some credibility to the fact that this may still be in the future to a degree as well. There's absolutely this appetite for how do I incorporate passkeys? We've been working with a number of technology partners to prove that out. I've got this whole stack of non-standard apps that don't speak modern protocols. How can I protect these with a phishing-resistant MFA product? Especially as you're looking at passkeys. So we do hear it from customers. There's no question about that. But as it comes into practical application, I think a lot of customers are honestly just looking to get to MFA. They're looking to get to that phishing resistant MFA capabilities. And I'm going to give you my 2 cents on the passkey scenario is that we're probably just a few years out yet from that just being so comfortable that every employee and especially every customer understands what passkeys are and how to use them. But in the meantime, you just hit on a core thing. That's what identity orchestration does, is how do you add something like passkeys or MFA provider of choice to your IDP of choice. Let's not go off the short menu of what the IDP offers natively. I want this product because of these reasons. That's great. That's a place that the orchestrator can bring the two together.
Granville, I had a guest maybe a week back who worked for a company called Serbi, and they have the password vault where they're pushing passwords into applications, because it turns out that a lot of applications aren't actually SAML or OpenID enabled. And when you look at the apps that a person uses, they probably have like 50 apps that aren't covered. For example, your social media accounts. I'm wondering if you haven't, and this is kind of a left field question, so I apologize, but do you have any thoughts about password managers, corporate password managers, and do those fit within sort of the realm of what you're looking at as an identity fabric?
Man, I have lots of thoughts about this space, but I'll probably save the audience. First off, I'm a big fan of password managers. I think that they provide a enormous benefit for the community and helping instill best practices across the board. But by taking a step back, if we look at like a lot of like enterprise applications, some of them might have their own internal database, right, that has those user credentials, which is why a lot of those other products exist, right? Like I need to be able to use the credentials that this application knows about, that has its own password reset flow, and to allow Mark to be able to log into application A. But when you look at this, it's like, okay, this application has these requirements typically because, they don't have an integration in with a modern IDP, or they have their own authorization logic on the back end. Now, because of this, is you could go that route where you actually ensure everyone stores these one-off passwords in a vault, and then you inject those in at login time. Another option that exist is what I like to call the sandwich of applications. So what you can do with Strata is that you can take this application. Imagine this application is, let's just say, a late 90s, early 2000s application that might use LDAP behind the scenes. It utilizes NTLM, and so on the backside, it's actually communicating using LDAP and NTLM. And that's how it's going to authenticate users. But on the front side, it has this ugly form, right? Like GeoCities style form, right? And what we can do is you can actually put the orchestrator in front of this application as an identity aware proxy. And what we do there is we ensure that the end users never see that ugly form. Instead, they'll see the login form for Entra, Okta, your IDP of choice. Now, on the backside is once the user tries to access that application, they're then going to be redirected to the IDP or like a sequence of IDPs, depending on the policy that they have defined. Once authenticated and authorized to access that application, we will then say, hey, we'll serve requests on the backside of the application when it's like taking the LDAP request. And we'll actually use the identities that were formed after that authentication to then validate the one-time user, one-time password that was injected into that application by us on the front side. That way, the application, it continues to utilize its legacy technology, but the end user still sees, they see like a modern login approach, right? They still see Entra being logged into. They never see that ugly form. And then on the backside of this, if you look at it from a risk standpoint, you don't have these like old legacy credentials just lying around, because instead we take these one-time user, one-time passwords that exist for maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds. And after that, they're completely gone. And it was only associated with that single session for login.
Are you saying that you actually like do a quick update to the LDAP backend, let's say Active Directory, with like password 12345, and then push 12345 instead?
No, it's actually even cooler than that. So just like we can be an OIDC provider and SAML provider, we can also be an LDAP provider. So we can actually answer LDAP requests on our side. And this is where we can actually answer those requests. And the way that we validate, say, an LDAP bind is that we'll then take the credentials that were put in, validated against the one-time user that we created on the front side after say Mark authenticated with Entra. Mm-hmm. And then we'll compare that, and if everything was correct, the attributes that we return to the application via like an LDAP search will actually be attributes that came from Entra.
I see. So the application, the legacy application, would change the LDAP provider to the local Strata authentic or orchestrator. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So and then they would have the same LDAP interface, and it would look LDAP standard. It would look the same to them, and then you would on the fly basically handle the bind request, because now it's your piece that can connect. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. Nice. So that's interesting. So what about for those other applications? What about for social login? There's no way social login actually could protect some important company assets, like my Twitter, my X stream, or my LinkedIn stream for my company. Do customers have any questions about that? Or do you just say, is that out of scope? Mark, maybe you could comment on those other applications.
I feel like you're picking on me, like just only because I spent 10 years at that Twitter company.
That's true. You're a Twitter veteran, so
and I can
how important it is.
No, it's interesting, and I can actually uniquely share that perspective. You would think that when I was at Twitter, during that time, of course, dogfooding the product, you would expect that all those social logins would have some way to have a really elegant way to share access to corporate accounts. And I can tell you that elegant access is a spreadsheet, unfortunately. And that's I'm not in violating any trust there. Is like that's what it is. And so as you think about Serby and you think about like this idea of shared access to a social login, that could be a really a good use case for that type of a password manager scenario. Typically we're looking more at the enterprise apps that are being used, not the staples or the LinkedIn or the shared marketing resources that someone on my team would share with 3 other people in a delegated administration fashion. But it's really the access to all those other enterprise apps that we focus on. And so truthfully, as you think about social login and Facebook and social media, that's not something that comes up as frequently with our customers.
Okay. I guess Granville will maybe dive back into the technical aspects a little bit. So what about workloads? Part of identity is not just the person authenticating, but actually the software that you're interacting with. And lately we've seen more and more processes where maybe one piece of software is talking to another piece of software. Is this something that you think will, is this new surface area, or does Strata also see this continuity for these B2B workflows, or these workload to workload workflows?
It's a really good question. which is fun because in a previous life, I worked a lot on machine identities and ensuring like identities for applications and distributed systems. Right now, we're solely focused on end users. I'm not going to say that's going to be
People.
true for the long term. Yeah,
People.
We're solely focused on the people problem of this. There's a lot of really good technologies that handle machine identities. Now, however, with that being said, while the majority of our customers use us for the people side, there are some basic things where we sit in and we're able to do basic machine identities, but it is not where we specialize today.
How about mobile applications? So sticking with person identities, but looking at mobile applications, either consumer facing or potentially even workforce facing mobile applications. Um, Sometimes they're using um, OpenID, but a lot of developers hate, using the browser flow. Are you seeing any impact for new requirements from mobile?
hmm Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's multiple different, like from our side, like when we act as an OIDC provider, obviously, that browser flow can be an issue. There's other flows that are available as well that our customers are starting to ask for, and it could be things for like IoT devices, and it also fits into certain types of like mobile apps as well. We see those requirements being asked, but it hasn't been a prominent thing yet because most of our customers today, the apps that we protect are like those hundreds of thousands of applications that exist within the enterprise. And so I'm assuming in the near future, we're going to see more and more of those other requirements come in, but we just haven't seen them yet.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're coming to the end, so maybe we'll go to last thoughts. Mark, anything you want to share, sort of last thoughts before we close up?
Definitely. I think that as you are looking at identity continuity, and there's this idea of, well, is there going to be additional cost and complexity in maintaining a second IDP? If you're using AD, the chances are that you've already got something set up that you can solve for. But you led off our conversation today talking about that hourly cost of downtime. I think what we're finding is that how can you afford not to have IDP continuity? We realize that we're not there for every single customer, that we're not a good fit. And we're not a good fit. And when I say we, I meant just the identity continuity offering, and maybe not for every application, but the ones that matter, those mission critical apps. And if you're in medical applications or financial services, you recognize how important it is and you can't afford to go down. And so I think just looking ahead, that identity continuity, my favorite part about being the storyteller for it is hearing from certain analysts or groups that will say that's not possible. And we're actually showing them that it is.
Nice. Granville, as the guest, you get a last thoughts. So any thoughts?
I do. But you know what's going to do better than my last thoughts here? Because I think Mark did a really good job from the risk side is, I'm a technical nerd. I love talking tech. So anyone that's listening to this, just reach out to me. Let's just have a conversation. Let's share your thoughts. I just want to have those. I'm not going to sell you on anything. I just want to, understand problems and see if I can help you find a good fit. So.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you guys being on the show today. So thank you very much. And I encourage everyone to check out Strata. Strata was founded by Eric Olden, one of the legends of identity entrepreneurs, one of the inspirations for even starting Glue back in 2009. So yeah, I encourage everyone to check out Strata. Next week, we're going to have an episode about the intersection of IAM with the cloud, Kubernetes, and cloud native technology. And Strata has a really great cloud story too, but this is really deeply impacting how we build and deploy identity infrastructure today. And I want to remind or ask people to follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to get to 1,000 follows. And with that, just thank you, audience, for joining us. And we will see you on Thursday. And thanks, guys.